Thank you everyone for joining. We have quite a good audience for OTel Q&A. We have Steven Swartz today with us. Now, just a quick note on the format. Oh, which Dan actually posted in the chat. Awesome. Yeah, so there I'll be asking Steven some questions, and then afterwards, time permitting, you'll have the opportunity to post some questions for Steven as well in the link that Dan provided. So, all right. So first things first, Steven, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. So my title at work is platform engineering, and I work for a company. They do payment processing. So, when you're working with payments, you're working with real money. You need to be kind of exact with your observability. What my team does is we manage all of the observability infrastructure. We've got about 100 technical folks that we're managing it for. And we try and be sort of like the experts in observability and share some of the best practices and help them solve their problems. So I recently joined this team about almost a year ago, and the project that I started on was actually migrating from another observability vendor where we're using proprietary instrumentation, and we adopted OpenTelemetry, and we moved to a new observability vendor. So hopefully some of those learnings are useful to other folks going through that process. And also worth calling out is that I really enjoyed contributing to the OpenTelemetry-collector-contrib repo. I had to do that to unblock myself with a few bugs that we faced, but it was also just a really good way to understand what the collectors are doing under the hood. I was completely new to Golang, but the code is really approachable. So yeah, I'd recommend taking a look if you haven't. It made my job a lot easier for sure.
That's great. Thanks for the intro. Now, can you tell us a little bit about the architectures that you use in your organization, like what programming languages are used and deployment landscape, that kind of thing?
Yeah, so I have that architecture diagram I shared with you. Would it be a good time to share that with?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. All right, so I believe my screen is visible. Everyone can see a diagram.
Yep, I can see it. Hopefully everyone else can as well.
Okay, so go kind of left to right. We can dive into specific parts that seem interesting. So we are running on Kubernetes. We have multiple production clusters. And within each of those clusters, we are using the OpenTelemetry operator. And that gives us a way to inject common configuration of the SDK into our team's applications into their containers. And it also lets us to automatically turn on auto-instrumentation. So we get consistent spans collected from all the apps.
Mm-hmm.
And another sort of unique part is we are using the OpenTelemetry, we're running OpenTelemetries as a sidecar, meaning that alongside each instance of the application, we have a mini collector running, and the app can send all their telemetry over localhost to that sidecar. So we are currently sending metrics and spans. Logs, it's a bit of a long story, but we aren't currently using logs through OpenTelemetry. For metrics, so we use OpenTelemetry, but as sort of like a hop, we also use Prometheus to scrape the sidecar before it pushes to Grafana. And another interesting challenge was getting tail sampling to work. Because we have spans coming from multiple Kubernetes clusters, and we only want to keep some of them, but we don't want to make the decision about which traces we keep until we have all the spans. Maybe we wait to see if there's an error. So we have a separate cluster that all the spans go to make that decision.
Gotcha.
And we load balance just to help scale that. We have these collectors in that common cluster. They just load balance by trace ID, so we don't have a ton of spans piling up on one collector. And yeah, that's sort of like a high-level overview of our setup.
That's awesome. It's really cool to see like this kind of setup out in real life because I think that's I do feel like that's kind of a burning question with a lot of our practitioners is like how do you set up your collectors? So it's very nice to see and cool that you're using the open telemetry operator. I think you're one of the few people that I've spoken with. That's not to say people don't use the operator. But you're definitely one of the few people I've spoken with recently who has been using the operator. What aspects of the operator are you currently using? Like, do you leverage like the auto instrumentation? Do you leverage the op amp capabilities? What's the other one? And do you leverage like the collector deployment capabilities? Like, do you use all three or combination?
So the main ones we're using are just the, injecting the common SDK configuration. That saves us a ton of time. We don't have to get teams to make code changes. We can just
Yeah.
manage that centrally and kind of push it out to all the teams. Same with the auto instrumentation. They just add, a line to their configuration of their, their pod, and then they get the instrumentation. The other ones you mentioned, we aren't using, but we are using
Okay.
the sidecar, which is the open telemetry operator injects.
Cool, cool. Yeah, I have to like put a plug for the operator auto instrumentation. It is actually so cool. It like you literally don't have to write code. You just put an annotation
Yeah.
in your manifest and then well and the instrumentation CR of course that you have to configure, but like it's pretty cool, I have to say. Yeah.
Yeah. The least effort you can make for teams, the better. Like even getting them to add the annotation, can sometimes take time.
Yeah.
So I think it made the migration go much faster, being able to minimize the amount of work they have to do.
Absolutely. Now, I wanted to ask because you mentioned that you had migrated from a previous vendor using their own proprietary telemetry solution. What made you decide to do that migration?
Yeah, so cost was a big one. It was hard to control in the previous vendor. Um, and I guess support wasn't good. So
Mhm.
those are, I think, the main drivers. I think just a lot of stakeholders were unhappy with it. And we wanted a bit more. The collector gives us a lot of control over costs that this other vendor doesn't.
Right, right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Now, another thing that I wanted to ask in terms of scaling your collectors, like have you experienced any challenges in scaling your collectors? Because you mentioned that you have the sidecar deployment pattern. How many different sidecars are you running at a particular point in time? Like, is it a lot that you're managing?
Yeah, so the for the sidecars, so we run one for each pod or instance of the
Mhm.
application. So that kind of almost scales on its own, which is
Yeah.
quite nice. Um, so that works. The tricky part with the sidecar is configuring the like how many resources to allocate, like how much memory to ask from Kubernetes, just because every application, is slightly different in their volume. And and there's not a way to, like at the app for a specific application, they can't say that they want a specific amount of memory. We need to configure that in our centralized configuration. So it creates a lot of coordination overhead if we want to tune that.
Right.
But we've only had to tune it, I think, for one application so far, one of our monoliths. So that has it's actually been quite easy to scale this, the sidecar.
Okay, that's great. That's great. Now, what about your load balanced collectors? How did you encounter any like challenges in setting that up?
Yeah. Well, I mean, at the beginning, there was, I think, a regression that caused the memory leak in one of the components we're using, the span metrics one. So that was a problem. That was actually one of the things that I fixed as like the open source contribution. Um, And I guess the way our setup is quite memory intensive because we have to cache our metrics in memory for Prometheus to scrape them. So yeah, it's really been a matter of keeping memory I guess at a reasonable level. So right now we use the Kubernetes horizontal pod autoscaler that watches the memory of each of the instances of the collector, and it makes scaling decisions based on that.
Yeah.
Um, it works pretty well. It took some tinkering. One thing I've noticed, and maybe I'd be curious if other people have a good solution for this, is when our vendor Grafana has, because we're using when they have an outage, I find the telemetry starts to pile up, um, waiting for service to be restored, and we see this big spike in CPU and memory. So it's quite hard to, I guess, like I think if the outage were to go for quite a while, probably the memory usage would just start to kill the collectors or be very high. So that's a bit of a problem we still have.
Right, right. Now another question that I had for you, just going back to the OTel operator, what made you decide to use the operator in the first place? Is it something that you had been made aware of, or someone like did did you hear about it from folks in the community?
So I heard about it actually from a colleague. So it was their recommendation, but it fit with the kind of platform, I guess, ethos of, just try and get out of the way of the developers and,
Yeah.
have a way to, I guess, do things without the developers having to get involved.
Right, right. Yeah, fair enough. That is one thing I like about the operator. Now, what was your experience in running it? Like, was it something that you felt was straightforward? Because I mean, one of the things that we really value about these sessions is not only like learning how you're using these things in real life, but also like learning like your user experience with using components of OpenTelemetry. So is it something where you felt like it was documented well enough? Did you have to do a little bit of digging, poke around, ask some questions in the operator Slack?
It was, I'd say generally like compared to the collector itself, it was very smooth, but I guess I mean, anyways, I'm not sure why that is, but yeah, it worked quite well. And the maintainers when we did have sort of minor issues, maintainers were very responsive in the Slack channels.
Awesome. That's good to hear. I've had always really good experience also with the hotel operator maintainers, so that's nice to hear as well. Great. Now the other thing that I wanted to ask is, when you're using your collectors, are you building your own collector distribution?
Yeah, we are. And that was because uh, when we faced some of those bugs, we couldn't wait
Yeah.
until it was pushed to the main distribution. So we forked it just to fix it earlier. And then once that happened, we kind of we started to make, other changes. So it's a bit hard to get off the fork now, but it's something
Yeah.
we do want to do.
Now, does that involve using the OTel Collector Builder tool when you're deploying your collectors?
Yeah, it does. I looked at sort of basically the Docker file, how they build the contrib repo and just kind of copied the commands from there.
Oh, okay, okay. Have you used the actual, because there's a tool where you basically specify like the components, like which receivers, which processors, etc., that you want to include. Have you tried using that tool?
Yeah. So that's what we're using
Oh,
to
okay,
build
cool,
it.
cool.
We
Okay.
copied like the list of components. Yeah.
Oh, okay, okay, got it, got it. Sorry, I misunderstood you. Awesome. And you mentioned you did your own customizations, and that kind of forced you to contribute back to the collector. It sounds like it ended up being like a win-win for your team. How was the experience of contributing back to the collector overall?
Yeah, it was a good experience. People were helpful and during the code review, it took a little while to get the code merged. Maybe this is like I noticed, you'd have a separate person for approving it, and then it would sit unmerged for a few weeks, and then you get all these merge conflicts because like the versions would
Oh,
be upgraded. So I had
yeah,
to,
yeah.
go back and update the Go mod files a bunch of times. So that was, I think maybe there's room to like once someone approves it to maybe merge it a bit faster, but I don't know the sort of the rationale behind that.
Yeah, fair enough, fair enough. And the other thing I wanted to ask, w- what you mentioned that you mentioned that you use auto instrumentation. Have you done any manual instrumentation as well?
Yeah. So yeah, we had to show teams because we had manual instrumentation using that proprietary format. So we had to show teams how to convert it over to the OTel format and then also educate them on how to, use OTel manual instrumentation.
And how did that go? Did you find that teams were receptive to that?
Um, it's still, I think they're slowly doing it. I think tracing isn't maybe like the power of, or the benefits of tracing isn't maybe as obvious. So I think probably I just need more examples of like why it's useful to give them the motivation to add more metadata to their spans, for example.
Right, right, right. Now does your team ever get asked to like instrument stuff for other teams?
Not specifically for their
Okay.
applications. Yeah.
I'm very glad to hear. It's one of my observability pet peeves. Well, that's good to hear. And so it looks like now in terms of the instrumentation, like it looks from your diagram that it's primarily like a Java app. Is that correct?
Yeah, mostly Java. We do have some Golang as well.
Oh, okay. Now, have you how did you find it in terms of like all the stuff aside, like with the learning curve for instrumenting stuff in open telemetry? Um, how did you find it like since you were in a position to teach folks how to instrument their code with open telemetry? Was it a big learning curve for your team as far as understanding how the manual instrumentation worked for like both Java and Go? Like, did you notice anything that was like maybe easier in one language compared to the other, or where you had to go back to the SIGs to ask for clarification?
Yeah, so Java, they've done a really good job with it. I think the language just makes it easier. Um, so yeah, because we use like there kind of we use that micrometer, which is like a Java library for emitting metrics. So they didn't
Hmm.
actually have to change anything to get the metrics to work.
Oh, okay, got it.
And yeah, the span API is pretty intuitive as well. Golang, I mean, that's not my personal strength, but I found it's a bit more manual. It's definitely harder to use than the Java one. And
Right,
I'm
right.
curious if anyone's used the auto instrumentation. I haven't had a chance to play around with that, but that would be we're not currently using it for Golang, but it would be nice if we could get that working.
Yeah, for folks who are listening, does anyone have experience with that would like to share? Feel free to raise your hand if you do have any experience. No takers. All right. Okay. The I guess I'm just about done asking the questions. The only other thing is that I was going to ask is, do you have any general feedback that you wanted to provide to the open telemetry maintainers around like your open telemetry experience as far as like using components like ease of use. You mentioned the contribution experience. You said it was a little bit challenging with approving the PRs. Anything else that you wanted to add to that?
I think like it felt like we were kind of figuring out a lot of stuff out for ourselves. Like it took us quite a few iterations actually to get to this point. Um, it might be hard to have a recipe for every combination of like, vendor and backend and all that. So that could be part of the problem.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, I guess like more sort of example configuration or would be helpful. Like for example, these load balancing. Originally, we actually had another set of collectors that all they did was load balancing.
Yeah.
Um, but we realized, oh, we can actually load balance to that, you know, this deployment of collectors can load balance to itself. And that is just way easier to maintain. So yeah, and I guess like sort of example configuration for common problems like tail sampling that we're doing right here.
Right. Yeah, that's really good piece of feedback. I have heard from other folks as well that because we have the open telemetry demo, which is a great showcase of I think it's really focused on application instrumentation, which is awesome. But I think there is definitely like a desire from the community as far as having some like more collector specific use cases and specifically like stuff that's a little bit more complex than what you would necessarily see in the demo.
Yeah, for sure. Another one is monitoring your collectors. Um, I found I had to kind of dig through the code base to find like what metrics are exposed, like what are they
Yeah.
doing. Um, and I feel like there's probably some common alerts or things that for most setups would be useful. So maybe someone already has this, but like somewhere we can document like, hey, these are useful things to monitor. Um, the dashboard that for Grafana they have that was pretty useful, but I think on the alert side that would be I didn't find anything there.
Right, right. Cool. Well, thank you for the feedback on that. Now I guess we can do one of two things. We've got the Lean Coffee board where folks can post questions for Steven. So I'm actually gonna check the board. Ooh, we have some questions. Yeah, let's go through that, and then if we have some time afterwards, then Stephen, you can ask some questions to our viewers as well.
Okay.
Okay, Dan, do you wanna take it on from here on the questions from the board?
Sure thing. We've got many questions from the audience, which is great.
On.
Also feel free to go and vote for the ones that you think are the most interesting there. I have marked one of them as answered already because we talked about the collector builder and how you build your own distro for the collector on your sidecar. Starting for the one that we talked about tail-based sampling a little bit, how you do the how you use tail-based sampling. But I wanted to ask this question here as like, do you only use tail-based sampling or do you also use head-based? And any tips or thoughts on mixing these approaches?
Yeah, so we only use tail sampling. I guess if you like it's more work to get it set up, but when you have the full trace to make your sampling decision, I find that you can make the best decision. So yeah, that's why we just lean on tail sampling completely.
I guess with head-based sampling, there's always a risk that you're going to miss something important, right? Because it's completely probabilistic. So yeah, good point. Moving on to the next one. How do you handle container sizing on the collector sidecars? You mentioned this already, that you had to customize or tune one of the collector sizes. So, do you have one size that fits all, or anything you would like to improve in that setup, or like resource allocation?
Yeah, so I think what would be nice is if pods could add like an annotation or saying this is the resources I need. Instead, what we have to do is kind of hacky. So for each sidecar, it's like a separate resource, like Kubernetes resource or configuration file. So what we do is we have like a for loop that goes through and creates those configurations for different resource combinations. So it's something we have to coordinate, like, hey, you have to, okay, update the sidecar configuration that your pod wants to use to this OTel sidecar, 500 megabytes, one CPU, or, so it's a bit of, it's an extra coordination work there. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, okay. Next one is related to serverless. If you use serverless and any tips or gotchas to look out for in instrumented serverless workloads with OpenTelemetry.
We don't use serverless, so don't have any advice there.
That's fine. Yeah, I mean, I wanted to ask that in case you had some experience with that. Also, you mentioned that you use FluentD for logs, reading from standard out. Are you considering moving to the OTel log file receiver?
Yeah, it's something I'd like to explore. We sort of had a bit of a issue when we first tried using logs. I'm curious if anyone has found a good solution for this. So what we wanted to do is like durably store our logs on disk. So if there's like an outage, we don't lose them. We ran into a bug with the durable storage extension in the collector, and that kind of spooked us. And we already had FluentD running, so that's why we kind of just pivoted to that. But I don't know, that was a while ago, maybe, and maybe people have had good success with getting that durability for their logs.
Yeah, just to add on this, with FluentD, are you decorating your logs with some of the semantic conventions or trace ID, span ID that so you can then correlate with your traces?
Yeah, so we definitely have the logs and, oh, sorry, the trace IDs and the span IDs, and we're actually adopting. There's a specification for the event. I guess they call it like log events. So it's sort of a structured format for logs in the OpenTelemetry specification. So we're trying that out as well. Yeah.
Cool. Do you use OTel to monitor OTel collectors?
We use yeah, it's like a big it's always a big ball of mud monitoring, but so we use Prometheus to get the metrics from the collectors and FluentD to collect the logs from the collectors, and that's worked pretty well.
Okay, moving on to a bit more of talking about your teams. Sounds like you folks have a dedicated platform team that manages the OTel collectors in your organization. Do you have any thoughts on the opposite of this, where you have no collector gateway or no collector endpoint, and then basically 100% of your telemetry data is then sent to your observability provider?
Yeah, I guess in our case, we decided to use the collectors so that we could do sampling to control costs of our traces, and also to try and have some durability. If I guess the vendor goes down, we can kind of move that like retry logic and off to the collector. Yeah, I'm curious if anyone's doing that in production. It would definitely simplify things, but I guess there's some trade-offs as well there.
Yeah, I guess there's a trade-off as well of authentication to a provider and so on, right? As it's all in one place as well. Some of the benefits, pros and cons, I guess.
Right.
The next one, it's related to well, we talked about auto-instrumentation, the auto operator, and how you inject those instrumentation packages. And then we also talked about the fact that you are also using like custom manual instrumentation. I guess the question is, how do you find have your teams found that auto instrumentation is sufficient, or is there a lot of custom instrumentation that's needed?
Yeah, so One thing I haven't talked about that I want to call it that's been great for us is the span metrics component. So we generate metrics, so frequency, latency, error counts for every single span. And because we're using the auto instrumentation, every application emits the spans in the same format. So basically, out of the box, without adding any instrumentation, we get like so I guess some vendors call it like APM or like red metrics. So like all your API calls, all your database queries, we have metrics on that automatically. So that goes quite a long way, and we can build like common dashboards and common alerts that all these apps just get out of the box because of that standardization. So it's a really good starting point. And then I guess so I like that is probably quite good, but then if teams want to add metadata, they can. So yeah, I would definitely recommend span metrics if that's like an option for people.
Yeah, I'm gonna add a bit to this one as well. Do you find that as in like, if you're moving from a world where like you had to instrument everything, and now there is a lot of auto instrumentation out there, do you find that engineers normally tend to not know about that auto instrumentation and they do it themselves? Or how do you manage that sort of like, I guess, learning or education piece, saying that you may not need to instrument things? Has that been a challenge within your organization, or everyone just do that?
Yeah, I say it is like we have some redundant, like for example, our API metrics, like Spring Boot and Java automatically emits the metrics. So a lot of applications we're getting some redundant data. So yeah, that has been a problem. But yeah, so I guess it just comes down to education and then having a way of tracking the cardinality. So when we've seen that, like, oh, you're sending a ton of API metrics and we already have it captured with span metrics, we can reach out to that team and say, oh, you can probably disable this. You don't really need this. We don't need to pay for it.
Mm. Cool. Regarding sampling, and then I'm assuming this is related to sampling policies. Can you advise on is that the collector where you manage the policies for all traces, or can teams dial that config up and down themselves?
So ours is pretty simple. So we sample, errors we keep. If the trace is longer than something like 5 seconds, we keep. But we do have an escape hatch if they add an attribute to their span to force sampling. So far, no one has it hasn't caused any problems. It might in the future if teams overuse it, but that's worked. That's worked so far.
Nice. And related to some of that SDK config that you currently inject through environment variables, do you currently use any type of other config that may not be supported through environment variables, like metric views, for example? Do you have a way to apply defaults across the board for that type of config?
I'm just rereading the question. Oh, I see. We haven't had to do that too much. And when we have, we do have, I guess our company is lucky in that we have sort of a tool that we can use to, it sort of generates applications from scratch. And then there's a way to sort of regenerate it. The regeneration doesn't work too well, but we know that most teams have a pretty similar format to their application. So when we do need to make a change that we can't do with the operator, it's usually just boilerplate copy paste. We can show them a merge request and they can copy it in. But it does take can take a couple months for every team to adopt that.
Cool. Okay. I guess one related to supply chain security. With the OTel SDKs, so how do you handle supply chain security so that OTel SDKs are safe to include them in application code, or do you build them from source yourself and then run your own security tests?
Are you thinking like this would be, if there's like a CV in one of the SDK versions, how would we sort of manage patching that for everyone?
Or I guess, yeah, or downstream or upstream dependencies from OTel packages. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, for a different reason, I kind of created a wrapper dependency that wraps like all the OTel library versions that we use, and we know they work together. Just because we found some versions were kind of incompatible. So from the app team's perspective, they depend on one dependency, and then they get all the OTel dependencies as transitive dependencies. So I suppose if we were to, if we need to upgrade it very quickly, I guess it would just be one thing that they need to update. Although that it works in theory, but then it's also caused the dependency conflicts just because at least how Maven works in Java. So I don't know if that's actually the best thing to do. It might be more of a headache than it's worth.
Cool. Thank you. Okay, so moving on to the next one, related to so the auto operator and automatic instrumentation. Is that your preferred solution, or can the OTel operator be used in parallel with SDKs? For example, they're not .NET in the case of the person asking this question. And do you provide some balance of scalability and configurability? Is there a recommendation here? My immediate concern is that the manual instrumentation inside the application could make it difficult to configure and manage at scale.
So it's this sort of like how to balance giving teams the flexibility to add manual sort of configuration and customization, and then versus the sort of defaults that we inject for them. Yeah. So, I mean, so far we do, I guess, you can't override the environment variables that are injected into the application automatically by the platform team. So far, I guess it hasn't been too much of a problem with teams. Teams haven't really wanted to deviate too much from the configuration that we've given them. But yeah, I'd be curious longer term if that does cause problems.
Thank you. This is an interesting one. Are your devs using the LGTM Docker container from Grafana to develop OTel implementations and then do local troubleshooting?
Not yet. Right now, they can only really test it by deploying it to our clusters. So we do need a better solution there, so they can test locally.
Yeah, I personally love that there's like more and more solutions coming up that are open source that allow you to see that telemetry in your own computer as you're testing. So yeah, a lot of really cool solutions out there at the moment. If you had a magic wand, what is the thing that you would love to add, remove, or change in OTel, and why? That is a loaded question.
Yeah. I mean, I think this is maybe short-term sighted, but if we could get rid of Prometheus in our architecture, and the reasons we can't right now is because we rely on Prometheus to kind of aggregate our data together for cost savings. Source span metrics, we generate like 50 buckets, histogram buckets for every span. So it gets really expensive. And if each pod has its own set of 50 buckets, our cost scales with the number of pods, but we use Prometheus to kind of like aggregate all the counts from all the pods, and that like cuts our costs significantly. I don't think the collector can do that today. So yeah, that would just make our architecture simpler.
Makes sense. Are you using multiple OTel backends to process some of the things that internally compared to your vendor, or is it everything going to the vendor, I guess?
We have one vendor, if that was the question that we're pushing to.
Yeah, so I guess, but you're not pushing anything internally to anywhere else. It's just everything goes to.
Oh, right. Yeah, we don't. Yeah.
Okay, and I think we've got time for one last one, and that is, given that the collector can quickly become a bottleneck due to back pressure, and do you see any disadvantages having the SDKs export that data directly to the back end, except for the cost con?
Yeah, I think that was similar to the other question about like why not just push directly to,
Yeah.
your vendor from your pod. Yeah, it does make it easier to kind of scale. You don't have to worry. Well, yeah, that's a good question. I guess you're shifting the back pressure then to your application. And then so yeah, it might be though easier to handle if it's smaller amount of data. But yeah, that one I'm not too sure about. If anyone has thoughts, that'd be interesting to discuss.
Yeah, that's maybe easier to handle, but also more impactful for the application. So I guess there are pros and cons there as well, right? So if you have all your telemetry sort of like shipped from your or out of your pod as soon as possible, there are benefits for that as well, right? In terms of impacts. So it's felt somewhere else in your infrastructure, because there will be at some point if your backend is down. But yeah, the
Yeah.
pros and cons. That's
Yeah,
everything.
and it seems like just looking at least at the Java SDK, they're pretty conservative about how much data piles up. Like I think it's like 1024 spans is the max it will like buffer memory before, or is some low number that before we'll start dropping it. Because I guess they're really trying to lower the footprint on the application.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, I think that's all we have time for. Thank you very much, Stephen, for joining us. We
Yeah.
had that was quite a lot of questions we went through from the audience. Thanks for everyone that joined and asked questions as well. Super nice to see engagement in this session at OTel Q&A. Do you want to say a few words, Adriana, to
Oh,
say goodbye?
yeah, thanks Dan, and thanks for doing the questions. Yeah, it's really nice to see the engagement from folks in the Q&A. I think this is a topic that really interests people. So we love it when you engage. Also, if anyone out there would like to participate in OTel Q&A or OTel in practice, we are always looking for folks to share their use cases with us. You can either DM either Dan, Reese, or me, or if you want, you can also just message us in OTel-sig-n-user, our channel in the CNCF Slack. We will be happy to hear your use cases and have conversations. And also, as I mentioned, recording for this will be up on YouTube. So anyone that you know that wishes they had attended but could not attend, let them know. We usually post on the OTel socials and also in the channel once the video is up. And
Okay.
thank you, Stephen, for joining us and answering all the various questions. We really appreciate your time.
Yeah, that was a lot of fun. Yeah, thank you for hosting this.